It is my honor this afternoon to introduce our two panelists on this session 5 labeled Reparation. I would like to introduce Dr. June Soomer. She is currently Secretary General of the Association of Caribbean States. In 2018, she was appointed as chair of the Open Campus Council of the University of the West Indies. You will find an extension of her bio on page 14 of your program. The other panelist is Rodney Worrell. Rodney is a lecturer in history at the University of the West Indies. He obtained his PhD from the University of the West Indies in 2010 with a thesis on George Padmore's social and political thought. He's a member of the government of Barbados' Task Force on Reparations and a member of the Walter Rodney Justice Committee. I will ask Dr. Soomer to make her presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. You know that post-lunch and post-tea periods are not good periods to give presentations. But I am so excited at being here, having been reintroduced into writing history by this topic of reparations. And I would like to thank Dr. Cato for encouraging me to participate in this presentation today on capitalism and slavery. From all what we have heard today, I don't have to tell you that this seminal work is very important in the journey that we are taking, the new post-independence journey with reparations. And it is because of capitalism and slavery that we have reached this point. And so what I tried to do was to situate my presentation in the proclamation of 2015-2024, which is the International Decade for People of African Descent. And because I am so excited at being here, never mind my face, it's just not an exciting one, but I'm so excited at being here, I think that I should start with my conclusion. Least I forget why I'm here, because once I get into this presentation, the excitement will overtake me. And so what I want to say is that the paper seeks to demonstrate that the calls for recognition, justice, and development articulated in the UN's International Decade for People of African Descent since enslavement must be underpinned by the solid reasoning for the restitution hinted by capitalism and slavery. And I want to position capitalism and slavery in the global context which it explored, as well as in the experiences of Caribbean people in a struggle that we must never be afraid to endure, for reparations is the next step in our emancipation. There must be atonement. On a more personal note, I have to state that I was there in 2013 and in 2014 when the CARICOM decisions were made at the heads of government. I am also a member of the St. Lucian Reparations Committee. And so I feel that I am justified in being here not only as a historian. Since 2016 also, I have served as the Secretary General of the Association of Caribbean States, and this morning when I made my comment about the pan-Caribbean nature of capitalism and slavery, that the ACS was what we were really speaking about, because I represent 25 member states in the region, as well as the 10 associate member states, and I have a very strange configuration called observers, of which there are 28 in the world. And I can tell you that at the level of the ACS, that since 2016, we have put forward, and you will be pleased to hear that, at our 7th summit of the association in Havana, Cuba, on June 4th, 2016, we had in our declaration sentiments on reparations. But I have to tell you that since 2016, that the change globally and the shift to the right throughout the world has meant that the reparations movement is once more under attack. And I will tell you why. In 2016, the ACS, in its declaration, said that we recognize that slavery and the slave trade were atrocious crimes against humanity. We reaffirmed the Durban Declaration, in particular the importance of establishing compensatory and reparatory effective resources and measures, amongst others, at the national, regional, and international levels, in order to cope with the persistent effects of the slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, and welcomes CARICOM initiative for the creation of the Reparations Commission of the Caribbean Community, and praises the efforts of said commission to correct such injustices. That's what we said in 2016. So, fast forward to 2019, we go to Managua for the 8th summit of the ACS member states. And again, because I write on reparations, I speak on reparations, I have again included it in my declaration. And I am told by some member states, including some CARICOM member states, that perhaps we should tone it down, and that perhaps reparations should not find itself in the ACS declaration, that it really is a CARICOM thing. Recalling, of course, when I talk about the ACS member states, I'm talking about all of the countries that border the Caribbean Sea. And so I said in response, after I had heard all of the responses, I said, as the first black woman to head the ACS, history would not treat me kindly if I removed reparations from my declaration. Of course, I got some support from other CARICOM member states, and so my declaration went forward, and instead of just recognizing, we support the 10-point action plan of the Reparations Commission of the Caribbean Community, CARICOM, and applauds this commission's efforts to correct injustices resulting from the genocide of the native peoples of the Caribbean and the transatlantic trafficking of enslaved Africans and slavery, which are counted amongst the most atrocious crimes against humanity, and reaffirming in turn the urgent need to request efficient measures for reparations, compensation, indemnification, or other in-kind measures of a national, regional, and international level. I share that with you because I think that on this 75th anniversary of capitalism and slavery, we have time to reflect. And my excitement when Heather called me to do this could be seen on my bed when I sat down and read every book I could find, from C.L.R. James to Capitalism and Slavery, to How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, to Frantz Fanon, to Aimé Césaire, right down to Britain's Black Death. I still have all these books on my bed. Don't ask me where I'm sleeping. But that's how you do it when something excites you. And so I came to a different understanding, because, you know, when you read Capitalism and Slavery as a student, you just do it for exams. But when you read it in the context of your real life experience and what I have gone through, if you read my biography on that, you will see that I'm many firsts. It's very hard for a black woman to be many firsts. And so you must fight for everything that you have. And I think that this book is, for a lot of academics, it's a book that gave them, information that spurred more research. But for me, this book is like a legacy. It's like a legacy because it gave to us a reasoning at a point when we needed a reasoning to move forward. And I don't take lightly anything that William says in this book, because one of the first things he says, and I think it was very deliberate, and I also mentioned it this morning, was that he looked at Gibbon Wakefield's argument for the reasons for slavery, which Wakefield says are not moral but economical circumstances. They relate not to vice and virtue but to production. And if you read more of Wakefield's work, you will see that he is considered the person who wrote the most on systematic colonization. So when the presenters spoke this morning about sugar and what happened with Tate and Lyle, I could understand it in the context of Williams's further attempt at decolonization and removing that systematic colonization from the region. Because colonization didn't stop at the end of slavery. It continued. And his work also with regard to integration and the removal and not supporting the British West Indies Federation was because he felt that all of these things were colonial structures that we had to deal with before we could really deal with our independence. And I really appreciate that. And so he understood that European empires grew because of slavery and the slave trade, and that the colonial expansions would further consolidate colonial power. And it is from this seemingly impassive view that this emerging nationalist would pen in 1944 a masterpiece that would have influenced the thinking of all of us. Throughout the history of the Caribbean and throughout the history of enslavement of Africa, we have documented evidence that the British understood the link between recognition, justice, and development, and that many calls for repayment and centuries of unpaid labor are well documented. This is not the first time we are dealing with reparations. We have dealt with reparations from the beginning of enslavement. And whether it is at the individual level or whether it is at the collective level, we have always sought to get paid for the work that we have done. And let me give you a presentation because I have done, let me read you a little excerpt. I have done quite a bit of research on the reparation movement in both Dominica and St. Lucia. And it's very interesting because most of the perspectives we get are from the bigger countries. So I want to show you that it is not a big country thing, that all of us have been in this fight together. And so there is a surveyor from St. Lucia named John Quinlan, a black man who is a surveyor in 1897. And he asked to address the Royal Commission 122 years ago. At that time, there was economic decline in St. Lucia, and the place was considered depressed. And so the commission was sent out to inquire as to what was happening. And Quinlan stated, "These peasants are descendants of the slaves that were emancipated 50 years ago. The British government knows perfectly well that they are entitled to just as much consideration as their masters received 50 years ago. Of the millions due these slaves throughout the West Indies, we in St. Lucia are entitled to many hundreds thousands. Make your amends, Britisher, while your chest is overflowing." He goes on to say, "It remains with you, Royal Commissioner, to remind Parliament that we claim from them some compensation. We are moderate. We ask for a loan to those who are in need of it, who are fit for it, instead of asking for a free gift for which we are entitled. The gold secured from the labor of our forefathers went as clear profits to England. None of it is here now. The people are entitled to some consideration For now, the force of circumstances has brought former master and slave on a financial level. All will heartily welcome the goal. As the slaves, when emancipated, derived some benefits from compensation to their owners, so will the descendants of owners today derive some benefits from the consideration to the descendants of slaves. So this is not, Williams was not the first to ask for, even if muted, compensation for the slaves or the enslaved. We have somebody long before him asking for that. But what Williams did with his work was to consolidate the movement. We had individuals before asking, not making an impact, but his work brought that impact. The other individual who came before him, and right after Quinlan, is Marcus Garvey. And Marcus Garvey, through his calls for repatriation and reparations, calls for reparations for the descendants of enslaved Africans. And both in Dominica, in the town hall, and in St. Lucia, in the cinema, you have these calls, and you have people who will be at the foundation of the labor movement at these meetings, calling for reparations and marching through the streets. In St. Lucia, it is recalled that when Marcus Garvey came, the only crowd capacity that maybe have exceeded him in St. Lucia was the year before when the Prince came to St. Lucia. And so these countries are very involved in the fight for reparations, and so are the people. One of the things that I have done as I have done the reparations lectures in these two countries is to give names to the people who are involved in the fight, especially women. I focus on women in particular. And I came across this female in St. Lucia named Petronille, a very French name because of our background. And Petronille, during amelioration, said to the master one day, "I have worked enough for the week already. I am not working today." And he took her and he hung her up in the stockade. And she died. And she actually died by the evening when he went to check on her. And the British government came in at that time and questioned him, and he said to the colonial official at the time, "This woman never gave me any respect. And so that is why I put her in the stockade." But by that time, it was too late. Amelioration in St. Lucia came to an end because of the fight of people like Petronille. And so we must not forget them. I am at the age where I tell stories, I'm sorry. But I was just telling them that I recently went to the Memorial Acti in Guadeloupe, and there's a whole exhibition of black people, paintings, sculptures, and so on, done by very famous French artists. It's called La Modèle Noire. And in La Modèle Noire, which is a whole exhibition in a room, you cannot find the name of the model. It's a black model, a black female model, a black male model. And so one of the things that I do is to try to give names to people who are involved in that fight. Now, like all historians, I have too much to say, but one of the things I would like to come back to is the whole issue of the International Decade dedicated to people of African descent. And if you read that whole declaration by the United Nations, you will see Eric Williams in it. Nearly every single part of it, whether it is the recognition or the justice or the development, can come almost entirely from capitalism and slavery, on which, of course, the Reparations Commission, CARICOM Reparations Commission, borrowed heavily. So we have been able to identify in this declaration all of what we have heard here today with regard to the development of Europe and what we need for our own development as people in the Caribbean. We can see in it the need for the greater knowledge that we need to spread throughout the region. One of our challenges is that we no longer teach history to our people. We can see that the declaration calls for the promotion of respect, protection, and fulfillment of human rights. We can draw from the declaration the need to have national, regional, and international legal frameworks according to the Durban Declaration, all of which are the works of the CARICOM Commission. And so, despite the unspoken call for reparatory justice in capitalism and slavery, which was established in the very first chapter of the book, Origins of Negro Slavery, where the race for global hegemony relegated Africans to an exploitable factor of production that was constant and made the Caribbean the incubator of all the genocide of races of human beings, we have to recognize the contribution of this book to the reparations movement. And we heard this morning very clearly that right at the forward of Hilary Beckles' book, Britain's Black Debt, that he acknowledges the contributions of capitalism and slavery, and we have to give capitalism and slavery its due respect.
Greetings. Yeah, I wish to start out by way of thanking Rita and the organizers for inviting me to be here. And I also have to give a special shout out to Ambassador Soomer, who was my tutorial leader many years ago in one of my courses in Caribbean history.
And no, I didn't dye my hair.
Right. Now, I want to speak about the struggles for reparations in the Caribbean. During the 1990s, Barbados was seen as being in the vanguard of the reparations struggle. It might still be seen as in the vanguard of the reparations struggle, but I'm not looking at this as any kind of case study. I want to look at some of the lessons, the tensions, and the contradictions, because the picture struggle is not always smooth and clean. Struggle sometimes is messy, and you zigzag and whatever. So I can't speak about the reparations unless I speak about implicit reparations, and these were calls for reparations by some early Pan-African activists. So 1937 at a meeting when Clement Payne was deported, Israel Lovell, the Garveyite, who was one of Payne's lieutenants, made the profound statement that black people cannot steal from the white man, because if we take anything, it will be only some of what they have stolen from our foreparents for the past 250 years. And clearly, Lovell was speaking about the debt that was owed during enslavement, but he was also speaking about the debt that was owed due to the brutal exploitation that took place in the 100 years after the emancipation of slavery. Frederick Small, F.A. Small, a 10 Smith, and I am stressing the 10 Smith because these are some of the real intellectuals. He was a long-standing Garveyite, a member of the Workers' Men's Association in Barbados, and he said, and this speech was made in the 1930s, and I'm constantly referring to this pearl of wisdom, because he had a problem reconciling how Barbadians could say that they were free. And he said, like, fancy how we can be free but still have a white king. 53 years of independence shortly, and we still have a white queen. So fancy how we can be free with a white queen. And at the Dean's Commission that looked into the labor rebellions in Barbados, and he's speaking about the causes, and while people are speaking about the reason, the cost of living, unemployment, he said no. The rationale behind the action taken by the people was this is the result of a long-standing grievance that was sown from the day that slavery was abolished. And he stressed that the slave owners were compensated, but the enslaved was not given one penny. They were turned loose like a pack of wild goats on a barren mountain, and they had to return to the house whence they came to work for a mere crust of bread. So many years later, Sir Hilary Beckles is talking about double victimization, and Small spoke about double victimization. In the 1960s, Leroy Haywood, a member of the Marxist PPM party, said that the land should be taken away from the planters and given to the laborers because of the misery and suffering caused by the plantation system. And around the same time, his colleague, Calvin Arlene, said that if on the eve of independence, if independence is going to mean anything, then the statue of Lord Nelson should come down from being in the center of Bridgetown and replaced by Samuel Jackman Prescott, and I'll say some more about the Lord Nelson statue, right? Haywood and Black Knight and others called for the renaming of the streets because of the imperialist names. So if you go to Bank Hall, you see Queen Mary Road, Queen Victoria Road, Buckingham Road, etc., etc. So those were some of the implicit calls for reparations. Now, the decade of the 1990s was a golden period for Pan-African struggle, was a golden period for the reparations movement. 2 major conferences taking place in Nigeria. But the conference that was very significant was, and this was the first major discussion in Barbados, was in 1991, as the Caribbean region was mobilizing for the 7th Pan-African Conference. There was a conference on reparations where Lord Gifford, in fact, there was a conference on galvanizing and mobilizing, and Lord Gifford was invited to lay the legal basis for reparations at that conference. And the conference, the resolutions passed, and the conference was populated by several Rastafarians, because you see it in the resolutions, repatriation of Africans desirous of returning physically to their motherland. And the conference also affirmed that all African people should be paid reparations ensuing out of slavery. Now, because of this current, and there's a certain triumphalism, because the Pan-Africanists believe that they played a major role, or they played their part in ensuring the defeat of the apartheid movement in South Africa, and they were up to the task to engage in this struggle for reparations. So the government of Barbados had a committee to review the Constitution of Barbados, and the Pan-Africanists set up their alternative, 6 Pan-African groupings, set up their alternative commission as well, and they came up with, called the People's Forum. And then they submitted the People's Forum report to the Constitutional Review Commission, hoping that some of their recommendations would be published or accepted by the Constitutional Review Commission. Unfortunately, they were not, but the People's Forum report called for a new preamble to the Constitution of Barbados because it felt that the existing preamble was racist because it trivializes and glosses over and disrespect the history of black people and also of the Amerindian people to whom the island belonged to before the coming of the Europeans. The People's Forum also called for reparations. In fact, it clearly stated that there should be a clause in the Constitution that establishes that all the black Barbadian community has a legal right for the payment of reparations from all institutions, both domestic and foreign nations that participated in the subjugation of and or benefited from the process of dispossession. It also called for the removal of the Queen as the head of state. And the removal of the Queen of the head of state was seen as a fundamental struggle because this spoke to the heart of the dignity of the people. So the removal of the Queen of the head of state was also about cleansing and clearing our thinking as an independent people. However, I said none of these very revolutionary proposals were taken on board. Emancipation Day was officially celebrated in Barbados in 1997. During the Emancipation Day celebrations, the Reverend Al Sharpton passed through Barbados and he raised the reparations question again. In fact, at this ceremony, he raised the reparations question again, so he added more fuel to the discussion about reparations on the island. In 1998, Fidel Castro visited the island for this celebration, and David Commission, who was the leader of the Clement Payne movement, called for the removal of the Queen of the head of state and all of the images, the white images inside the churches. However, a section of the Pan-Africanists felt that David Commission had the stage and he had the moment where he should have called for monetary reparations. And these individuals were so passionate about calling for monetary reparations that some of them severed their ties from the Clement Payne movement and called themselves African Reparations Incorporated because they believe that the Clement Payne seemed to be coming a little too close to the government and they were seemingly willing to compromise an issue as critical as reparations. They were proven correct to some extent because by later in the year, the Commission for Pan-African Affairs was created. And the leading Pan-Africanists, David headed this commission. The leading Pan-Africanists in the island served as members, as board members as well. Now, the Barbados Labour Party that had the label, whether correctly or incorrectly, as a conservative party, was trying to undergo some kind of transformation, some kind of political makeover whereby they were reaching out to quote-unquote grassroots politicians, and they were also reaching out to Pan-Africanists and other progressives. And this is why some Pan-Africanists felt that it was a good idea, because the kind of respect that they lacked before, no longer seen as this fringe element. Also, it was believed that they were going to be able to fund projects, given the fact that, and we know, I am saying as an activist, marginalized and ostracized within the BLP. However, they agreed to give critical support because the success or the failure would also redound to them as well. So there was a need to give critical support. And even whilst Prime Minister Arthur seemed to have embraced the Pan-Africanist, sections of his cabinet started to put out some negative signals about whether they were truly embraced. And there was some resistance from the civil servants as well. Right? There was a belief that the Pan-Africanists did not understand how the bureaucracy works. So there was some tension there. But because of the discussions surrounding reparations weren't going anywhere, right? And this is what led Prime Minister Arthur to call the Committee for National Reconciliation, because he could feel this racial tension. And this racial tension was, I think the best manifestation was in 1990 when Nelson Mandela was released from prison. There was a big celebration at Farley Hill National Park, and the Free South African Committee said, well, let us name the park after Nelson Mandela. And the white people in Barbados, led by Cow Williams, who one of the richest white men in Barbados, said, can't happen. I give you 6 acres of land and you can create your own Mandela Park, because Farley Hill represented something to the white people. And the Free South African Committee rejected this proposal, and the various sides, the defenders of Cow Williams, as well as the supporters of Free South African Committee. So Barbados was not settled, and this is why they had the National Reconciliation Committee. But when they held their meetings, the question of reparations was taken centerfold as well, right? And in fact, the committee, if you read their report, included support for reparations, but they were cautious, and they stated that the issue of reparations needed to be properly understood, and it should not be trivialized. The report noted that the reparations fight was still in the embryonic stage, but the government of Barbados should take an active interest in the international campaign. And this did happen in 2001. The World Conference on Racism, Barbados played an important role in terms of mobilizing the Caribbean for the World Conference on Racism, and the Pan-African Commission played an important role as well. The Barbadian and the Caribbean was credited for getting the statement in the Durham Declaration, where slavery and the slave trade were seen as appalling tragedies, right? And slavery was seen as a crime against humanity. So we have to credit Barbados and the Caribbean, and this process would have started earlier as well. So the reparations, and then Prime Minister Arthur, I'm traveling fairly quickly now, Prime Minister Arthur in 2007 he's given the Wilberforce lecture in 2007 at the bicentenary, of the abolition of the British slave trade, and Arthur tentatively broached the subject of reparations. And he's saying, well, it need not to be controversial, and he called for a few scholarships for the Caribbean people. Now, a section of the Pan-Africanists felt that Arthur was making sport. Arthur had reduced the reparations discussion to a very low level. Others credit him because he was the first prime minister to have gone on record calling for some form of reparations, but he can further contextualize while the reaction might have been fairly not supportive of Arthur, because there was a falling out between Arthur and David Commission, and people took sides. Also, Arthur had retreated from, if we want to call it a progressive agenda, because he had retreated from the removal of the Queen as the head of state. Right? This was one of his outstanding feelings, because several people had bought into, and he had already gone ahead and had there was a a Republic song. So people thought that this was going to be a natural process as well. Now the task force, Barbados Task Force Reparations, created in 2012, wide cross-section of people, and the task force engaged the Barbadian public again surrounding issues of reparations. I sat on that task force, and one of the issues that we had to really wrestle with was dealing with the civil servants, because all the time we seem to be getting some traction, then somebody was transferred. So we never had the kind of continuity that allowed a smooth functioning of the task force. But given our limitations, I think we did some work. And people question how serious the government was to the whole issue of reparations, because there is a reparation, or I should say there was a reparation task force in existence, but all the time leading members of the party were calling for the closure of the commission, and even threatening that they were going to close the Pan-African Commission. So this seemed like a major contradiction. We had the elections, and since the elections, this is part of the correction, since the elections, the task force has not been reconstituted. The commission has been a victim of the Barbados economic recovery and transformation program. So it is no longer funded, and if it's no longer funded, it no longer exists. Because I'm saying now, we seem to be at the crossroads in terms of the reparation struggle. Rastafarians, who were normally in the vanguard of the reparations discourse, for the moment, they seem to be distracted, because the conversation is happening surrounding medical marijuana, and they want a seat at the table because they were formerly oppressed and suppressed because of the marijuana, the marijuana business. So if money is going to be made legitimately, we can understand why they would be distracted. And then there's the moment as well where they're trying to seize the moment to press home the decriminalization, at least the signals coming out of Parliament last week is that they might be allowed to use marijuana at their religious, religious sacrament. So we seem to be at the crossroads, and I see it that whenever you're fighting battle, right, sometimes you have to retreat, sometimes there's a lull in the battle. Because I'm always optimistic as an activist. So I'm saying then that some of the lessons out of this was that the reparations struggle can only be successful if it is a total people struggle, not a Pan-Africanist struggle, nor not a governmental struggle. Because I recognize that from the time the task force was created, it seemed like many of the groups that were active in agitating for reparation seemed to have taken a back seat and seeing it as a government issue. A concerted effort must be made to overcome some of the frustration caused by dealing with the civil service. The government must, and this is where I'll finish, the government must embark on more self-repairs by naming and renaming the imperialist streets and buildings. And when I talk about the committee, National Reconciliation Committee, if you read the report, the committee was lauding the government for saying that they were going to remove Lord Nelson. So we're saying 19 years after this report was written, Lord Nelson's statue is still standing large. So the removal of the Queen of our head of state, the removal of honors and titles like the Order of the British Empire, Queen's Counsel, Sirs, Dames, must be abolished. And I think that this question for real self-repairs would provide the necessary spark, energy, create the energy and enthusiasm to seek reparations for chattel slavery and racial genocide from Britain, France, and Holland. I thank you.